Welcome back. We're discussing the escalating crisis in Ukraine and its impact on the region. Joining us now to give us the view from Russia is former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov. He joins us from London. Alexander, thanks for joining us. Well, as we heard just a moment ago, the US Secretary of State John Kerry accused Russia of wanting to destabilize Ukraine. He also said that Vladimir Putin wants to do to the rest of Ukraine what he did in Crimea.
Well, it's a bit rich of John Kerry to say this because, let's face it, the crisis started not in Crimea. The crisis started in Kyiv when a legitimate government was overthrown by the so-called protesters. And obviously then events started to take place which are practically not under anybody's control. Now, the important thing to understand is this. If the regime would not have been toppled in Kyiv, there would not have been a referendum in Crimea. So that's a very important point to remember. Now, there were warnings made even before the events took such a dramatic twist in Kyiv that other regions in Ukraine were feeling nervous, that the Russian ethnic majority in the east was feeling nervous, and in Crimea as well. So to say now that these events were created, this crisis was created by Russia is absolutely remarkable.
But we do have these facts on the ground that Crimea had the referendum, voted to rejoin Russia. There is now talk of a diplomatic solution to this. John Kerry has been talking about that again, and he said that he's looking at a meeting between the United States and Russia, as well as the European Union, in about 10 days. That meeting will take place somewhere in Europe. Is there a diplomatic solution to this?
Well, at the moment, I think it's very difficult to talk about any diplomatic solution because what we're witnessing in some of the cities across the east of Ukraine is basically a situation that has gone out of control. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after. Now, what my personal worry is, and I think it is shared in the Kremlin and in Moscow generally, and across Russia, is that the new regime, the interim regime, might decide to crack down on those people who are protesting in Donetsk and other cities. Now, that can cause a crisis that erupted in Kyiv when the legitimate regime was overthrown. Now, that might lead to a situation when Russia might inadvertently be sucked into this crisis. Now, believe me, President Putin does not want this. Russia does not need this because Russia simply cannot afford to have a full-blown crisis in Crimea on its borders. So the thing is, of course, that Russia would want to find a solution out of it. And of course, Russia has no plans of moving its troops into eastern Ukraine. But what we're witnessing now is a situation out of control completely. This was triggered by events in Kyiv. And I don't really know how we're going to see them develop. Now, I really hope that the people in Kyiv, the interim regime, think twice before they do anything.
But there has been talk from Russia of some kind of a loose federation in Ukraine, where there'd be a large amount of autonomy given to those parts of Ukraine which have a Russian-speaking majority. Federation, as far as Russia calls it, but some are saying this is actually looking at partition. Russia wants to partition this country.
Well, I think that the federation is a very reasonable proposal. And I think it's a reasonable proposal because, first of all, it will calm down the people in the east and south of Ukraine. Because what we're witnessing now is basically the feelings of those local population, that are not being really counted on, they're not being really looked at properly from Kyiv. Now, the situation at the moment is such. If the Western countries, and America first and foremost, will not stop this propaganda war, I think this will only escalate. You know, just to go around and say, let's de-escalate, and at the same time do things that basically provoke some of the people in eastern Ukraine to do dramatic things is not a good idea. Now, this meeting that is suggested in 10 days' time, you know, I don't really place that much faith in this because Russia has to see something happening on the part of the West and the interim regime in Kyiv that will show some sort of goodwill. At the moment, we see a weak government, interim government in Kiev, not knowing what to do, making up all sorts of wild allegations against Russia. We hear John Kerry saying that Russia has sent special troops, special forces, and its spies, as he called them, to stir trouble in eastern Ukraine. This is just silly. This is just, inflaming tension, not decreasing tension. I think everybody has to calm down now. Everybody has to make a step back. We are really, really looking at the possibility of a civil war in Ukraine.
Well, if we look at it from the United States' point of view, I mean, it sees what Russia has done as a violation of international law. It's imposed sanctions. There's the threat of more sanctions. And just in the past few hours, there's been another destroyer, U.S. destroyer, that's been deployed in the Black Sea. How worrying is this for Moscow?
Well, as regards sanctions, I don't think that, we can to talk about a return to some sort of a Cold War in economic sense, because both sides cannot afford a Cold War. Both sides, and the West and Russia as well, they can't really afford a serious confrontation and in economic terms. There will be no military confrontation, and you know why it will not be military confrontation? Thank God for the nukes. This dream of President Obama of no nuclear weapons, it's a crazy dream. This is the only thing that keeps everybody, restrained. But, building up a military presence by NATO around Russia, in the Baltics and other places, is not a good thing. It will only lead to more tension, and it will only create more uncertainty and nervousness on the ground in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. So I think at the moment, there's just has to be a clear understanding that this is a potential civil war in the center of Europe. It has to be dealt with diplomatically. Nobody can afford this war to break out.
We talked a moment ago, we speculated a moment ago on Russia's intentions and why Russia, in the first place, supported this referendum in Crimea and then supported Crimea being reunited with Russia. Give us some idea of where what the Russian thinking is.
Well, first of all, Crimea, there was never really opportunity for the people who lived there to have a referendum. There have been many examples, when Western observers and politicians were saying, but there was a referendum. No, there never was a proper referendum. All the referendums took place when there was the Soviet Union in place, and there was a completely different situation. This is a self-determination. People have decided in a referendum to become part of Russia. Nobody was threatening them. Nobody was putting pressure on them. You can't really force people a 93% vote in any country. Now, President Putin has said that he has no plans, Russia has no plans of sending troops into eastern part of Ukraine. And this is correct, this is true, because Russia cannot really afford to take on a huge chunk of Ukraine.
But there are thousands of troops deployed right now at the Ukrainian border, Russian troops.
Right. Well, that's several points here I need to make. First of all, there were 8 missions by international inspectors, including Americans, Canadians, and others, and Ukrainians, that have visited the areas along the border with eastern Ukraine and have not registered any signs of a dangerous buildup. This is very important. I don't understand why it has not been made public. Secondly, Russia has the right to have some military presence along the borders of a nation which is uncontrollable, ungovernable, where a possibility of a civil conflict, a civil war, is very high. This is reasonable. Any country would have done it. But again, I stress, Russia has no plans of sending troops to eastern Ukraine simply because the situation might get out of control even more. Now, here's the situation, here's another point. You must understand the pressure on Putin coming from the Russian population, from the Russians themselves. 80% support what he's supporting what he's doing. But if something happens in Donetsk and other cities. If the interim regime decides to crack down and create a situation, by the way, which had happened in Kyiv itself,
right.
What might happen is that we might see volunteers moving into Ukraine. Putin might not be even able to control the situation.
Okay, Alexander, we're going to have to leave it there. So far, it has been very good for Vladimir Putin domestically. His popularity ratings are very, very high. But we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for joining us.